Hello, everyone. I'm Josie Foss, the Executive Director of the Progress and Poverty Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. I am joined today by one of our Progressive Ideas grantees, Dr. Francesca Ruggiero. Dr. Ruggiero is a postdoctoral scholar in the Kenneth C. Griffin Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. His research primarily lies at the intersection of public finance and urban economics, with a focus on property taxation and the spatial structure of local governments in the United States. Today, Dr. Ruggiero will be talking with us about a research project titled Overlapping Jurisdictions and the Provision of Local Public Goods in the U.S. Metropolitan Areas. Dr. Ruggiero, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and for the opportunity to talk about my research.
Wonderful. So my first question for you is really basic. What motivated you to study this topic to begin with?
So I think it's a fascinating topic, especially for somebody who, like me, was not born in the United States and is from a country where fiscal federalism is significantly weaker than it is here. And it started off as a project about competition between jurisdictions, specifically local governments in the United States. And specifically, how do people respond to changes in government spending and, as a consequence, changes in tax rates by these local jurisdictions? Do they move? Do they stay? Do they all like it? How do prices respond? Etc. And something I realized is that there is really something specific about property taxation in the US, that in contrast to changes in corporate income taxes or personal income taxes or sales taxes that are mainly levied by state governments in the US, when it comes to property taxation, there's a very, very tight link between government spending and property tax bills. Most people are able to see very clearly how their property tax liabilities are being spent. And this is not typically true of any other sub-federal tax in the United States. And so this makes it very interesting to study, in my view, the implications of changes in property tax rates and, as a consequence, local government spending on mobility and the location choice of people, precisely because people are much better able to see what specific bundle of services their tax dollars through property taxes fund. And there is an extensive literature about the mobility implications of changes in corporate income taxes across states or even personal income taxes. But when it comes to property tax changes, the evidence was a bit more limited, mostly because data on property tax rates and the boundaries of the huge number of jurisdictions, of local jurisdictions in the US, were not really typically readily available. And so I really saw a gap there and said, well, I mean, this looks something where I can make multiple contributions. And as I learned more, really personally, about these local governments, I realized that the structure and the geography of local governments in the United States is very, very complex. It's not really just one layer of local governments that provide a generic set of public services, but it's really a web with very complex boundaries of jurisdictions that specialize in the provision of different local public goods. And this is very dynamic, has changed dramatically in the United States in the last 80 years. Especially we think about, the number of counties has roughly remained the same. The number of municipalities has changed a little bit. The number of school districts has decreased substantially because after the Second World War, as the US population became more and more urban and suburban, there were consolidations and mergers and dissolutions of school districts in rural areas. But despite this, the number of local governments in the United States has increased enormously in the last 80 years, and there are now approximately 91,000 local governments in the United States. And this growth is almost entirely driven by special purpose districts, namely jurisdictions that, as the name suggests, specialize in the provision of local public goods. And so we have emergency medical services districts, fire protection districts, hospital districts, park districts, water conservation districts, but also, mosquito abatement districts. So it's really a wide range. And so when thinking about, how I could study this topic, I realized, well, there is something really interesting here, that when Americans pay their property tax bills, they don't just send a check, but they can really see a whole list of local governments that levies its own tax rate. And so citizens end up paying the sum of the tax rates levied by overlapping jurisdictions. And this is not exactly the same everywhere. As you can imagine, there's vast heterogeneity across US states. And so actually in the Northeast, it's not exactly the best place to answer this question. But when it comes to the Midwest, the mountain region, the Pacific region, this is really evident. Here in Illinois, where I am, a property tax bill contains, 10 to 15 local jurisdictions overlapping. And so this gave naturally rise to a lot of questions that, in my view, the literature hadn't really paid a lot of attention to.
I think you've definitely hit on something. It's incredibly complex. We do a lot of work, in property taxes ourselves, and the overlaps, and as you're saying, the special purpose districts are a bit overwhelming at times. Keeping that in mind, I guess my next question is, how did you tackle it? What data were you using? What were your methods? Like, how did you get your arms around this analytically?
So the geography of local governments in the US is extremely interesting, and a key problem in assessing the overall big picture of local governments in the US is that the data are not stored in a centralized way. Each state maintains its own data, and in some cases, not even states collect their own data, which meant that there was considerable work being done to collect these data. And in some cases, the boundaries of special purpose districts are not even that clear. In many cases, when it comes to school districts, counties, and municipalities, obviously, we know where they are. But I realized that when it came to the vast number of special purpose jurisdictions, in many cases, maps or shapefiles were not readily available. And so in some states, I really had to construct them from scratch by looking at property assessment data and literally parcel data and assembling them to back out and matching them with property tax data to back out what the boundaries of the special districts are. And something similar really was true for property tax rates as well. In previous data sets did not really allow us to know the whole composition of the property tax rates in a given location. Of course, we could know what the county rate was, we could know what the school district was, but we didn't have a sense of the sum of the whole components adding up to the property tax rate that people end up paying. And so there was a lot of work being done for this, and I'm obviously very grateful to the Progress and Poverty Institute for supporting this. I think it would have not been possible without your help because a lot of manual labor was needed for this purpose. And I think now for all of the 50 states plus DC, we now have the boundaries of all local governments in the last 20 years and all of the property tax rates levied by specific jurisdictions, again, in the last 20 years. And if you look at my paper, there's like 50 maps at the end showing where tax rates are higher or lower. And this, I think, was not really possible before this paper. And so going back to really how these data were used, given the complex geography of local governments in the US, my question was, well, what are the efficiency implications of this overlapping structure? What did we miss by only considering local governments as just jurisdictions that provide all services together? Well, the key thing that I think we were missing is that when we think about changes in fiscal policy at the local level, like any change in a local amenity, that induces a change in local housing prices. If a specific amenity or a specific fiscal policy is appreciated valued by potential home buyers, then home prices in that area will tend to appreciate. And this may be whole symmetrically for amenities that are not valued. This is not just true, obviously, for changes in government spending, but could be true for the opening of a polluting plant or any other amenity that changes the value of land. This is really how capitalization works. And so this obviously was very well known before this paper. What I think was slightly underappreciated is that when the boundaries of these local jurisdictions overlap in such a complex way and to some extent unpredictable way, because some local governments span multiple counties and they cover an entire metropolitan area. In some cases, there are municipal utility districts in Texas that cover just a few blocks. And so there's really a wide range of boundaries and possibilities. And so when a given local government makes a fiscal policy change, and we know that typically that fiscal policy change will be capitalized into home prices, well, that might have indirect effects on the jurisdictions that in part overlap with the initiating jurisdiction. So if a school funds a new gym and a new building and purchases new facilities through a property tax hike, maybe that location will experience a change in home values. But the values, at least some, the value of homes in a part, at least, of the school district will overlap with other jurisdictions that have nothing to do with the original school district. This means that for large enough changes in property taxes, that capitalization might affect the property tax base of jurisdictions that have nothing to do with the initial school district that made that fiscal policy decision. And this is by definition, I would say, a textbook definition of fiscal externality. So people that did not want their fiscal policy variables to change end up paying some of the prices, potentially also the benefits of the fiscal policy change made by the original school district. And this compounds because the more jurisdictions there are overlapping in any given space, the more likely this is to happen. And this ends up, in my view, being potentially problematic when in many states there's a lot of freedom in drawing the boundaries of these special purpose jurisdictions. Why? Well, people who essentially want and highly value a specific public good end up drawing the boundaries of that jurisdiction in a way that allows them to reach easily a majority in their own newly drawn jurisdiction. And so it becomes sort of a country club idea of local government. That would not be a problem per se, but when there are spillovers onto jurisdictions that did not want to make that fiscal policy decision in the first place, then at that point, that freedom ends up having, through capitalization, some repercussions on people that simply did not want to pay more taxes or did not want to have the value of the tax base changed by somebody else. And so combining the geography, the boundaries, and the tax rates I collected, I tried to combine this evidence into a model that formalizes this intuition and allows me to a bit more systematically answer the question, what are the efficiency consequences of the vertical structure? And the best way to do so would be to combine this model with a regression discontinuity design. And this is a method in applied econometrics that allows us to compare jurisdictions that narrowly approved versus narrowly rejected, in my case, changes in government spending. And so by comparing jurisdictions that approved the spending change versus rejected the spending change, we can isolate sort of the causal effect of a change in government spending on various outcomes that are important for the model, namely location choices, so the population composition, but also housing prices, as obviously this is key to understand capitalization, but also property tax rates, which are themselves endogenous, because it's just the ratio of government spending over the value of the tax base, and so on and so forth. And so with this regression discontinuity design combined with the model, I'm able to sort of back out the primitives of the model, what allows us to carry out counterfactual exercises and understand hypothetical worlds and simulate hypothetical worlds in which this vertical overlapping structure could be replaced by a structure in which the vertical overlapping doesn't exist. And we sort of give back power to hypothetical municipalities that provide a bundle of public services, exactly like Chartibou in 1956 was conceiving of local government. And so it's based on the preliminary results in my counterfactual exercise. It seems to be the case that the vertically overlapping structure induces efficiency losses. So this is mainly driven by the fact that by keeping municipal boundaries, it would be harder for certain pet projects to reach a majority because, as I was saying before, these local governments are really drawn by people who have homogeneous preferences. I find using the data I collected that it's much more likely for a new jurisdiction, a new special purpose district to be created where the composition of the population is homogeneous. So people tend to have similar values precisely because it's easier for them to reach a new majority. By going back to municipal boundaries, some of those pet projects will not be approved. And overall, this induces efficiency gains. And this is sort of a big picture of the paper.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. In reading your paper, I was really struck, by the data work that you had done. I mean, you alluded before to the fact that these data were not forthcoming and that you had to do all this legwork to create them. I mean, that alone felt like an incredible contribution. And then the methodology that you employed, very impressive. You already touched a bit on the results, but can you talk a little bit more specifically about what you saw in terms of effects on local spending and property tax levels, as a result of the way that these jurisdictions are conceived and sort of creating externalities?
Yeah, I think the main effect I find is that relative to, precisely because of how easy it is in many states to add new layers of government, overall spending and taxation are higher than they would be if the vertical structure did not exist. So this is really the main consequence, that in a setting in which people vote directly or indirectly through representatives on whether to increase spending or not, having special purpose districts makes it very easy for certain people who particularly maybe know the system better, are more informed, and value specific public goods more. It's easy for them to, reach a majority and approve new spending. But that spending ends up affecting other people indirectly through capitalization, but also within the special district itself, some people who are just less informed and they have a higher cost of participating in local elections. This is, very important. Christopher Berry, Professor Berry here at the Harris School of Public Policy at Chicago, has done a lot of work about selective participation in local elections in the United States. And participation in local referenda and mayor elections and all sorts of local elections is extremely low, 20 to 30% on average. And very often these local elections are scheduled not to coincide with the general elections in November, which means that only people who highly value a specific public good will turn out, or people who have an easier time paying attention. And in another related project, I find that these people tend to be older households, typically without children, who end up being sort of the median voter among those who vote. So the median voter in these local elections is not the median resident, is a very different person. And this means that those who end up dictating local policy at the local level are not the median resident, but people who highly value and have more time to think about these problems. And so this ends up meaning, paired with the externalities I was referring to earlier, that some people just end up, bearing the consequences of fiscal policy decisions made by other people. And overall, the main effect is that government spending and, as a consequence, property tax rates end up being higher than they would if these highly committed local residents instead had to go through, for example, a municipal budget instead of their own little district, where they can easily affect the outcome of these policy-making processes.
So incredibly interesting, because you see it, as a resident kind of play out at the local level, but getting that 10,000-foot view and really being able to speak with authority on what the effects are of the system is just very eye-opening. So in your paper, in your research, you talk about a potential solution of horizontally differentiated general purpose governments. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and what the welfare benefits are of that type of approach?
Yeah, I think, state constitutions make it very easy in many states, not all states. Obviously, there's heterogeneity across states. State constitutions make it easy for groups of citizens to get a new jurisdiction approved. And once a new jurisdiction is approved, it's typically pretty hard to have it removed. It takes a long time. If I recall correctly, in the Chicago metropolitan area, until not long ago, there was a special district devoted to tuberculosis protection. Now, I'm pretty sure that tuberculosis has not been an issue in Chicago for some time, and still the special district that levied taxes for tuberculosis protection was in place until the early 2000s. So this gives a sense of, it's really, hard to get rid of new jurisdictions. So even when it's so easy to create new jurisdictions, then you wind up, it's easy on the way in, but it might be harder on the way out. And this compounds and new needs that come up over time end up adding on top of already existing jurisdictions. So I think these obviously require changing this structure, requires constitutional changes, and so obviously the paper offers a simplified model to talk about what the consequences would be, and I am fully aware that it is not something that would take a couple of days. But I think it is important for local policymakers to realize that this freedom has costs. Because I think most people would tend to think that, oh, well, let them create their own local government. They're going to pay for it. The people who want it are going to pay for it, right? This is sort of the idea. But unfortunately, the costs are not always visible. And especially when we think about selective political participation, whether in local referenda or more in general, the people who are going to be more likely to knock at the door of local politicians. And we think about the fiscal externality through capitalization into home prices and affecting, as a consequence, the value of the tax base in other nearby locations. These actions have consequences that may not be visible. They are not pecuniary and something that you immediately visualize. And so I think the big picture is that the more we go back to a structure that is similar to what happens in the Northeast of the United States, where more powers are concentrated in towns or cities, the better it is. And this has got out of control, I think, in certain parts of the country, in Illinois, the Pacific region, the mountain regions, where really you could have 15 local governments and in a given place, and the more there are, the harder it is to keep them accountable, and the more likely it is for these special purpose districts to act in a way that is in the interest of very few highly selected people who really value the specific local public group. So that I think there are benefits also in terms of concentrating the attention of residents to specific elected people with whom they can complain, as opposed to a huge variety of semi-elected or even appointed, in some case, politicians. So the big picture, obviously, the big picture of the paper, what I would like this paper to convey in terms of message is, let's try and develop a structure in which politicians that people already to some extent trust, could be mayors, that feel more accountable, are in charge of a larger share of the provision of local public goods, as opposed to disseminating and sort of dividing political power into fragmented jurisdictions that are accountable to no one except for the very few who really care about the public good being provided.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask you about the public policy implications of the work, but I think you just summed it up. The system is not actually functioning in our collective interest. And it seems like there's some ways to remedy that. I guess my last question would be about you and your future research. So, it feels like you're already making super important contributions. Where do you see yourself going from here?
I think, I have, started working on a similar question that has to do with a specific type of local government, which is actually not really a local government, a type of institution that exists in many areas of the country, namely tax increment financing districts, TIFs. Here in Chicago, they are prevalent. I think we have almost 100 of them just in Chicago. And although these are not local governments, they are essentially areas in which local residents manage to keep a larger portion of their property tax revenue and not share it with other residents through the municipal budget. So essentially it becomes kind of a NIMBY or actually NIMBY property tax policy. This initially was intended to, favor reconstruction and improvements in areas of the city of Chicago, in this case, that needed to be requalified. But of course, it ended up being overused, and now there are pretty high income areas of the country that have created of the city that have created their own TIF to finance the provision of very, very local, hyper local public goods. And so I see obviously an analogy here there with my own current work. And there's a common pattern, the idea that these institutions are being created with the purpose of retaining tax dollars in very specific areas. And obviously, this has implications for redistribution of local resources. And in the case of TIFs in Chicago, I think there is a bit of a grab, of a search for property tax revenue by people who live in different neighborhoods. Because once you see micro governments being created in the neighborhood, well, other people will say, well, I want to keep my revenue too. And so at some point, the whole city is covered by TIFs. And the point is then, well, why do we have a municipal government in the end? And so I think the project on TIFs is exactly going in the same direction as the overlapping jurisdictions project. Try to understand what are the costs of allowing highly selected people in certain neighborhoods to keep property tax dollars for themselves, even if they don't really need it to requalify a neighborhood that is experiencing difficulties.
That definitely feels like a complementary line of inquiry to what you've been working on. And wow, I could see how both this research that we just discussed and your future efforts in TIFs, it could just escalate and amplify the problem at the municipal level, significantly for taxpayers and residents that, as you said, have a lot of redistribution effects that I think we don't necessarily want or need. So, well, Dr. Ruggiero, thank you so much for speaking with me today. It was wonderful to get to hear about your research. I'm so glad we were able to support it. Incredibly impressed with the work that you've done. And I'm guessing, you're moving the needle in this area. And I can imagine that the data that you've curated are going to be incredibly useful for all sorts of inquiries. So thank you so much for speaking with me.
It's been a pleasure, and thanks again for your support. I can really say that it would have not been possible to complete this research without your support because, as I described earlier, it was a really, really labor-intensive process. Thank you very much.
Very happy to support.